So I've recently completed my first full playthrough of Path of Champions using Echo, and by doing this I learned what works and what doesn't. And here are my 10 top tips to help you crush the new game mode. Firstly, I always recommend trying to play fast and an aggressive playstyle over a control playstyle. Winning games fast is so important in Path of Champions for a few reasons. Aggressive decks are generally a bit more consistent. You're not going to get a bricked out hand with an aggressive deck, and that's a big deal because one loss and you lose your whole run. So it's important to make your draw as consistent as possible and focus in on cheaper units and spells to make sure you always have plays available in the early turns is a much more viable strategy than relying on more expensive cards. There is one exception to this rule, which is when you play against Karma. And that's because of Karma's unique effect where she starts the game with 10 mana. So if you're on a map with Karma, you actually want to push towards more of a slower build than you normally would. Obviously, in all the games you're not against Karma, you'll still want a good start, but Karma is very difficult if you only have cheap units, so that is the one exception to this rule. And the most important reason why we play fast is because it reduces chip damage. If you play really aggressively and win in the early turns, it gives the AI very little time to get any damage, and obviously because damage adds up between each stage, you really want to reduce and take as little damage as possible. And this leads me on to my next tip, which is all about minimizing the chip damage you take. And for this, what I'd recommend is you take bad trades just for the point of saving HP, only if you're already in control of the game. Your priority should always be in winning the existing game you're playing, but if you're already confident that you're going to win this game, you need to focus on saving as much HP so you have as much health going into the next game as possible. Usually, if you're playing in PvP, you would only block with a unit if your unit would trade 1-for-1. But in this mode, it's very different. Even if you don't get that 1-for-1 trade and your unit only does the 1 damage to your opponent's unit and it doesn't really matter, sometimes that's worth it just for saving the extra HP. My next recommendation is you should be stacking all your items onto one card, be that a unit or a spell. The easiest way to win in this game is have lots of copies of just one OP card. And often a champion is the best target, and this is because you can target champions more easily with the champion item chests and the relic items which unlock after reputation level 6. But it doesn't just have to be champion, and I've won lots of runs of strong units and strong spells. One thing that's really important about this is once you start buffing up one card, even getting bad items on that card is often worth it, because whenever you get an item on a card, usually you get the extra copies of that card as well, and that is really important to building the average strength of your deck up. And that's what deck building is in this game mode. You want to be building the average strength of each card in your deck up as much as possible. And I'll come on to that a bit later. Whatever card you choose to stack items on should also synergize with the powers you select. And this is really important in later rounds, especially against Zed and Nautilus, I find are the hardest bosses. And in those, if your stacked card does not synergize with your powers, you may really struggle. And the perfect example of this is in one of my runs, I had a 5/5 Poro and I had Trifarian Might, which means any unit with 5 attack or more instantly strikes my opponent's weakest unit when it's played. So having this 3 mana 5/5 come down, kill one of my opponent's unit is a massive big tempo swing. And that pretty much won the run for me. And a 3 mana 5/5, yes, it's strong, but in Path of Champions, it's not that ridiculous. But the synergy with the power made it insane. So having that good synergy between whatever card you choose to stack and your power is really important. And when it comes to picking what items you should get on your cards, my top tip is that mana is insane in this game. Any chance you have to get extra mana is so strong. So I always pick items which can reduce mana cost. If you get Ancient Coin, which only reduces mana cost by 1, then I would consider getting other options, especially if you get like a good stat buff, like a +2/+2. That can be worth it over taking the mana discount. But in general, I'd take mana discount over everything. And related to this is some of the strongest powers in this game are the ones where you start with extra mana. So in my opinion, what is the single strongest power in this game is the one which starts you with full spell mana every round. This basically means you start with 4 mana on turn 1, and then you have 5 mana on turn 2, 6 mana on turn 3. It's absolutely nuts. And if you get like a power like that, obviously you need a lot of spells to synergize with that power, but that's part of the decks you build have to synergize around the powers you get as well. My next tip is all about rerolls. The best place to use your rerolls is almost always for your powers. The strength of powers can vary quite a lot, but overall there isn't that many powers, which means it's less random when you re-roll it. Like if you re-roll a couple of times, you'll probably hit a half decent power. Whereas if you're re-rolling on an item, you get the variance of it could be any card, it could be any item. You're just not likely to get something good, and it often is a waste of a re-roll because most of the options when you get an item on a random card are quite bad. The second best place to use re-rolls apart from powers is champion items, and again that's just because it's a bit more consistent, because you have a fixed number of champions in your deck, so you know what cards it's going to go on. Often as well, you want to be stacking items on champions already, so they're quite buffed up in units you want to get items on. So the only thing which really changes is the items, and again, it's just a little bit more consistent than re-rolling random cards and random items. So I really recommend saving re-rolls for powers first, and then champion items second. And obviously, if you have a lot of re-rolls and you're coming to the end of your run, you might as well use them to try and hit something better if you don't like any of your options. But I do recommend powers and champion items only. And one of my key recommendations for re-rolling as well is don't get too greedy. If you see an okay option, go with the okay option rather than trying to search for a great option. I have screwed myself over by re-rolling away a good power and only getting bad powers afterwards, so don't get too greedy when you're re-rolling. The next tip is all about pathing, and the different nodes and options do vary in strength. Always getting more powers is always the most important thing. In my experience, I haven't been able to miss any powers anyway, so you don't really need to path towards it, but I'm just saying it here in case somehow you get into a situation where you can avoid a power. Always get a power if you can. Next, I'd recommend trying to hit as many items as possible. What type of item node you want to hit depends on whether you're stacking a champion, a spell, or a unit. So obviously if you're stacking a champion with items, you want champ items. If you're stacking a spell, spell items. And if you're stacking a unit, go for normal items. And finally, the last node I'll aim for is shops. There is one more node that you can hit, which are gold chests. And honestly, these are awful. I don't know what Riot was thinking when they were putting these gold chests in. You get 50 gold, which is absolutely nothing. Never makes a difference. There's not really that much you want to spend gold on anyway. Yeah, just don't go for gold chests. They're just awful. They're just a wasted node and not really worth it. And one thing I will add on about pathing as well is that the rarity gems on the icons matter. So if you see an epic gem or a rare gem, the higher the rarity, the more likely you are to get a better item or power. But I wouldn't focus on that too much, because it's more important to focus on stacking one card with bad items, like I mentioned before, because you get more copies of that card, and that's the most important thing, just getting lots of copies of a stacked card. So I wouldn't focus too much on the rarity, but if you're undecided between two paths, sometimes that rarity can make the difference and is something worth considering. Next up is looking at purchasing items from shops. So generally, I don't buy many cards from shops. What you really need to be considering about when you're buying additional cards for your decks is, does it increase the average power of your deck? And because your deck is already going to be filled with cards which have items and stuff on, buying a card without any items on is often a downgrade for your deck. So it really should be a rare action unless you get a card which really synergizes with your deck's game plan. But you do also get shops where you buy items for cards already in your deck, and these do not add additional cards to your decks. So I would always buy items for cards if they do not add additional cards to your decks, because it's not diluting your good cards, it's just making those cards you buy items for a little bit better. So that's always worthwhile doing if you have the gold to spend. And when you do this, always pay attention to the text at the top of the shop, because that tells you whether it will add more cards to your deck or whether it just adds items to the cards. So always pay attention to that text at the top, because it makes a big difference. And finally, the most important thing with shops, always buy reroll tokens. They're dead cheap. 30 gold for a reroll token. It's an absolute bargain. So always buy reroll tokens when you can. Somewhat related to buying cards as well is, for each map, you need to really plan around the champions you're facing. And there are 3 champions in particular, which in my experience are the hardest, which are Karma, which is on the Ezreal map. Ezreal is actually not a problem, I found. Karma is the much harder deck. And like I mentioned before, she starts the game with both of you at 10 mana. Against Karma decks, you probably want to go for more expensive units or bigger plays, and also look for removal to get rid of Karma, because if you can find something like Vengeance which can allow you to get rid of Karma easily, then that's an easy way to defeat that boss. And Karma is definitely a big boss you need to worry about. And the next boss I think is a big one you need to plan around is Zed. And for Zed, the map in general has a lot of elusives on it. So buying elusives that you can use as blockers is a key way you can beat Zed. And actually, in my run where I finally beat Zed, it took me a few attempts, I bought some elusives without items from the shop. And the last one, which is quite a difficult map, is Nautilus. and that's because he gives all his units tough. So I had the Ravenous Hydra item, and this item means when you play your champion, it does 1 damage to all your opponent's units, which is really, really strong on most maps. But against Nautilus, it's completely useless. I had to take this item off to be able to stand a chance of beating Nautilus. And it's just little things like that. There's certain cards which do 1 damage. You don't want to be picking up cards which do 1 damage against Nautilus. My next tip all revolves around a feature which is unlocked at Reputation level 7, which is cutting cards. Do not underestimate how strong this effect is. If you're experienced in roguelike games like this, you already know how strong cutting cards is. But if you're less experienced in games like this, do not underestimate the power of cutting cards. Like I said, deck building is all about improving the average power of your deck, and cutting out the weakest cards is a great way of improving the average power of your deck. But it does come with a big trade-off, because you can only cut cards at healers and instead of healing. So my recommendation is, if you're on 20 HP or more, you should always be looking to cut cards. If you're on 10 HP or more, then you need to consider it, but really consider how confident you are in your deck and how strong the cutting option is. Because if the cutting option is a bit meh, then obviously take the healing. If the cutting option is great, then maybe you can risk it. Also consider the fact that once you beat the midway boss in each map, you get fully healed back up to 30 HP. If you're coming up to that boss and you're confident you can beat it without healing, then maybe that's a good reason to cut cards, because the extra 7 HP you get from healing doesn't matter if you're going to full heal after that boss anyway. And finally, my top tip is combat tricks. The AI is not designed to play around combat tricks. Because of this, you can bait your opponent into really, really bad trades. Even the bad combat tricks that you don't commonly use in PvP are really insane in this mode. And additionally, the AI doesn't often use combat tricks, so there's no need to worry about these combat tricks when you're blocking. The only exception to this is Sejuani, and that's because Sejuani's champion spell is Fury of the North. So if the AI already has a Sejuani on board, just consider the fact that they could be playing a Sejuani's Fury of the North from their hand. That's it for my tips. So hopefully this helps you take on the game mode. And if you think there's any tips I may have missed off, do leave them in the comments below and help each other out.